Okay, so today we're diving into some pretty intense stuff, actually. You asked us to really dig into this book, Death by China, right? By Peter Navarro and Greg Autry.
Yeah. Death by China, Confronting the Dragon, a Global Call. Quite a title.
Definitely grabs your attention.
It does. It does. And you were really interested in, like, what are their main arguments? What evidence do they use? Like, really getting into the nuts and bolts of it.
Totally. So we went ahead and pulled together some, different excerpts right from the book itself. We've got some of the early praise it got, the table of contents to kind of see the big picture, and then selections from some of the chapters that seemed, pretty key.
Yeah, makes sense.
The mission here, especially for you, is to really distill the essence of how these authors see China's impact, globally, but especially on the U.S. We want to give you a solid grasp of their viewpoint without you having to wade through the whole thing, and hopefully spark some aha moments along the way, right?
Right. Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, this book, it caused a bit of a stir.
Yeah.
You had people like Buchung Kate Sering, he's from the International Campaign for Tibet, and he was really praising the authors, saying they really got the complexities of China.
Right, and Simone Gao from NTD TV, she went as far as calling it an eye-opener, even saying, read it before your next trip to Walmart or maybe the unemployment line. I mean, that's pretty strong.
Sets the tone, doesn't it? And then you've got Elizabeth C. Economy. She's from the Council on Foreign Relations, and she actually, compared Navarro's work on China to, Al Gore's work on climate change. This could be a huge wake-up call.
Wow.
Yeah. And Stuart L. Hart from Cornell, he was also talking about just the wealth of information in this book, and its global importance. So it clearly resonated with a lot of different people.
Yeah. And it's also interesting, the dedication to all of our friends in China. May they one day live in freedom, and until that day remain safe. And then right after that, they have this quote from Albert Camus, about not wanting to be on the side of the executioners. It really signals this concern for the human cost, right? Yeah. Within China, even while they're being so critical.
Yeah, and I think that's really important, right? It kind of frames the whole analysis. It's not just bashing China as a country or the people, but it's a focused examination of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party and what those actions mean for everyone else.
Exactly. And when you glance at the table of contents, this book, it tackles a ton of stuff. It goes from product safety to, the economic impacts all the way to China's military and its influence around the world. It's definitely comprehensive, if a bit critical.
Yeah, and they lay out this core principle right away. The first chapter is titled, "It's not China bashing if it's true," which basically tells you how they're approaching this whole thing. They're saying, look, this is just us reporting the facts as we see them, no matter how harsh it might sound.
Right, straight up. No sugarcoating. And that takes us to part 1, which they've titled Buyer Beware on Steroids. So right away, they're focusing on the potential dangers of products made in China.
Yeah, chapter 2 jumps right in with a pretty alarming title, Death by Chinese Poison, Bodies for Bucks and Chicks for Free. It's about dangerous and toxic Chinese products, and some of the examples they give are pretty unsettling, honestly.
You start with the melamine contamination, right, in food, and this wasn't just a one-time thing. They talk about it being in milk, baby formula, pet food.
Right.
And the apparent reason, melamine was used as a cheap filler to bump up the protein levels so they can make more money, even though it's known to cause kidney problems and even deaths, not just in China, but around the world too. And what's scary is that the book suggests this problem didn't just go away, It kept popping up even after the initial big scandals.
Yeah, and I think what's really disturbing about that is the sheer scale of it, right? And the lack of real accountability, it seems.
Right, and then they go on to the heparin contamination, which led to hundreds of deaths, thousands of illnesses in the U.S. and other countries. That's huge.
Huge, yeah. And to try to understand, how something like that could even happen, they bring in this perspective from a Chinese scholar, Lue Yadong. He talks about a kind of moral degradation within Chinese society. And he suggests that, with a weakening of traditional values like Confucian principles under communism, there's this relentless pursuit of profit, no matter the cost.
So it's not just about regulations failing, it's a deeper societal thing almost.
Yeah, that's the argument. And they mention other stuff too, like fake food products, adulterated rice products being sold cheaper with no apparent guilt from the sellers. It's a bit of a dark picture they're painting.
It is. And then chapter 3, Death by Chinese Junk, strangling our babies in their cribs, shifts to the dangers of just poorly made stuff.
Yeah, right away they hit you with this story about a kid, Brian Donnells, who got badly hurt when a Chinese-made ATV, like, malfunctioned and caught fire. So it really brings it home, the danger of these unsafe products.
Makes it real, for sure. And from there, they look at all the different, lines of defense, right? That should be there to stop unsafe products from getting to people. And they argue that these lines are, constantly breaking down.
They point the finger at Chinese regulators, saying that, there's so much focus on profit that there's not much incentive to actually enforce safety rules.
Right. And then they criticize American companies, too, for being maybe a bit naive, not taking responsibility, even trying to cover up problems. They specifically mention Walmart as an example.
Yeah, and they talk about how American border inspectors and consumer protection agencies are just, completely understaffed. They can't possibly keep up with everything coming in.
No way. And the statistic they give about product safety notifications in Europe is crazy. They say that products from China were flagged 22 times more often than U.S. exports, even though they export roughly the same amount. I mean, that's wild.
Yeah, that's a big difference. And they don't just focus on, the systemic stuff. They also talk about instances of just, plain stupidity in manufacturing.
Yeah.
They give this example of dimethyl fumarate, DMF, being used in leather furniture.
Okay.
And the idea was to prevent mold during shipping. But then when people got the furniture, their body heat released this chemical causing burns and eczema. It was happening all over Europe. UK, Finland, France, Poland, Sweden. You got to wonder, how does that even happen?
It's mind-boggling. And then they talk about product adulteration, #2, specifically lead paint found on tricycles made in China. And they kind of implicate American corporations, too, saying they should be doing more to ensure safety standards.
Right. And then there's this concept they introduced called the quality con. They attribute to this guy, Paul Midler. The idea is Chinese manufacturers will make, really high-quality samples to get a contract, and then they slowly start using cheaper materials to boost their profits.
Finicky.
Yeah, totally taking advantage of American companies who, they've offshored their production, but they've also offshored their risk management. So they're not necessarily catching this gradual decline in quality until it's, a major problem.
Wow. And they give a specific case study about this company, Hangzhou Zhongsheng Rubber, that was making tires.
Yeah, they reduced and then, completely omitted this important gum strip in the tires they were selling to a U.S. company called Foreign Tire Sales. So this cost-cutting measure directly impacted safety, and it put the American company in a really tough spot ethically.
That's rough. And to sum up their points on product safety, they outline what they call the 5 pillars of China's unfair trade advantage. These are the things they say contribute to these ongoing safety issues: illegal export subsidies, the undervalued currency, stealing intellectual property, lax environmental protections, and they even say slave labor. And these 5 pillars, they keep coming up throughout the book. It's their framework for criticizing China's economic practices.
Yeah, it's like a cycle, right? They help China undercut everyone else by externalizing costs like labor, environment, innovation, while also getting support from their government.
Right. And that brings us to the bigger economic picture. They talk about the huge loss of manufacturing jobs in North America since China joined the WTO back in 2001, big drops in apparel, textiles, furniture, chemicals, paper, steel, tires, even high-tech stuff like computers and electronics.
And they make the point that it's not just about the people who lost their jobs, right?
Yeah.
It ripples through the whole economy. It contributes to the decline of these, whole manufacturing towns and communities.
So it's a much bigger problem than just, people being unemployed.
Yeah, way bigger. And that's where they introduce their 8 weapons of Job destruction. Now, we don't have time to go into all of them, but they start by highlighting a few.
Okay.
So first up, #1, illegal export subsidies. They explain how these give Chinese companies a huge advantage right from the start. They might get direct financial support, tax breaks, stuff like that, which makes their products cheaper to make.
Right, so they can undercut everyone else right away.
Exactly. Then there's #3, rampant counterfeiting, piracy, and intellectual property theft. They argue that China basically steals technology and designs, which saves them tons of time and money on research and development. This gives them a big cost advantage, especially in industries like pharmaceuticals, cars, solar panels. And the thing is, it's not just about losing money now. It's about, hurting future innovation.
Right, stealing the ideas that would drive future growth.
Yeah, exactly. They also talk about #5, ultra-lax worker health and safety standards. They paint a pretty grim picture of working conditions in some Chinese factories. injuries, illnesses, even deaths. And tragically, these lax standards contribute to lower production costs, which makes it hard for companies in countries with stricter rules to compete. They even quote the New York Times to highlight how bad it can be.
It's a reminder that, those cheap prices we see often come at a human cost.
Absolutely. And they touch on the rare earth cartel, too, how China can manipulate the prices of these key materials, maybe even forcing competitors out of business.
And that makes other countries dependent on them, which is, not good strategically.
Right. Then Chapter 5 is all about death by currency manipulation. So they explain how China keeps its currency, the yuan, artificially low compared to other currencies, especially the US dollar. This makes their exports cheaper and foreign imports more expensive, which is like a subsidy for their exports and a tax on US exports. And they say this contributes big time to the trade deficit and slows down the US economy. They even mention this scary financial nuclear option that China could use.
So basically, they're manipulating the system to their advantage.
Yeah, that's the argument. Chapter 6, Death by American Corporate Turncoat, is where they get really critical of some U.S. companies. They talk about these 3 waves of offshoring and how the reasons behind it changed over time. The first wave was all about cheap labor, but the second wave, after China joined the WTO, was more strategic. American companies started taking advantage of China's unfair practices, kind of like, if you can't beat them, join them, but for export purposes.
So it wasn't about selling to the Chinese market. It was about using China to sell to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And then the third wave, which they say is the most dangerous, is all about this grand illusion of the huge Chinese consumer market with 1.3 billion people.
Right, that everyone's chasing.
Yeah, but to get access to that market, American companies often have to transfer their technology, which the authors call the mother's milk of innovation. They give examples like GE moving production to China and Westinghouse sharing nuclear technology. And they see this as super short-sighted, like it could really hurt American companies in the long run.
So they're trading short-term gains for a long-term decline.
Yeah, that's the idea. And then Chapter 7, Death by Colonial Dragon, focuses on China's economic activity in developing countries, especially in Africa. They describe it as a bait-and-switch strategy. China offers these big loans for infrastructure projects, but then they often use their own workers, extract resources on unfair terms, and sometimes even contribute to poverty and conflict.
It's like a new kind of colonialism.
Yeah, and they talk about how more Chinese farmers are going to Africa, but they're growing food for export back to China, which hurts local farmers. And there are stories about mistreatment of workers in Namibia, water denial in Kenya, even shootings in Zambia. They even compare it to, like, imagine if China seized farmland in the U.S., just to make the point.
That's a scary thought. And they say that China's, amoral code in these dealings really undermines Western values and influence.
Which leads into the next part of the book, where they look at China's military power and espionage.
Yeah, Chapter 8 is Death by Blue Water Navy, and they start by talking about how the West completely underestimated the Chinese military after Tiananmen Square.
Right, they say we need a Winston Churchill moment to wake up to the danger of this, heavily armed totalitarian regime.
And they remind us about the Korean War, the human wave attacks at the Chosin Reservoir, to show how determined China can be.
Yeah. And then they go into all the details about how the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has modernized. They've got new stealth fighters like the J-20, designed for bombing missions.
And their navy is growing fast. They got that Soviet aircraft carrier, the Vuryag, refitted it, and named it the Liaoning, after a guy who invaded Taiwan, which is, a little ominous.
They even talk about how they allegedly bribed Turkey to let it through the Bosporus.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the carrier killer missile, the DF-21D, which is a big deal.
Yeah, and they mentioned this suspected underground submarine base on Hainan Island. They're really building up their capacity.
Big time. And they make the point that China could potentially have such a numerical advantage that they could overwhelm the U.S., even if our technology is better.
So it's not just about technology, it's about sheer numbers.
Right. Chapter 9 is about death by cyber and traditional espionage, which they say is the biggest threat to American technology and national security.
Espionage? Really?
Yeah, they're serious about it. They say China's approach to intelligence gathering is different. It's more decentralized, less traditional, and they describe this 3-pronged strategy: infiltrate academia, industry, and government. Steal information, technology, and prepare for future conflicts. They talk about how they recruit people, appeals to nationalism, promises of money, even threats against their families back in China.
Wow, that's intense.
And they say all the Chinese nationals coming to the U.S. every year provides cover. It's like swim with the fish. blend in.
Makes sense. And they're critical of law enforcement, saying they're not doing enough, and the public is just clueless about how big this problem is.
They even call some American universities naive cheerleaders, saying they're too dependent on Chinese money for research and tuition.
Oh, interesting. So they're saying universities are almost complicit?
Yeah, in a way. They give specific examples, too, like this guy, Quan Wan Park, tried to export helicopter engine technology and night vision gear. And then there were these sleeper agents, Dong Fencheng, a Boeing engineer who stole space shuttle and Delta IV rocket designs, and Chimak, who stole submarine technology. And they point out that the sentences these guys got were pretty light.
That's surprising, considering the severity of what they did.
Yeah, the authors definitely think so. Then Chapter 10 is about death by red hacker. They talk about cyber espionage as a way to, level the playing field, technologically speaking.
Okay.
They explain how China's red hacker groups are connected to the Communist Party, but they can deny it. And since the internet in China is so tightly controlled, it's unlikely these are just independent hackers.
If they were going after their own government, they'd be in big trouble.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's this idea of the Manchurian chip, which is kind of scary. They're talking about the possibility of secret back doors or kill switches in computer hardware made in China, which is, most of it these days.
Right. Pretty much all computers are made there now.
Yeah. And they say this could let China control critical infrastructure in other countries. They even mentioned that the U.S. did similar stuff during the Cold War.
So they're playing the same game, just, a different side.
Yeah, that's what they're saying. And there are intelligence reports about China trying to map U.S. infrastructure and implanting destructive software. It's not just theoretical. They're saying it's happening.
That's concerning. Chapter 11 takes us to space. Death by space, the final frontier.
They acknowledge all the different ways to look at China's space program. Technology, resources, maybe even a way to escape Earth someday.
Right, but they're really focused on the military aspect. They talk about the development of anti-satellite weapons, ASATs. Remember in 2007 when China destroyed one of its own satellites? Created a ton of space debris?
Yeah, I remember that. Everyone was worried about it.
And they talk about the potential for plasma attacks and how China wants to be able to take out other countries' satellites. There was even this incident where a Chinese spacecraft got really close to the International Space Station and released a microsatellite. Some people think that was a test of an ASAT weapon.
Wow, that's pretty aggressive. Yeah, and they talk about asymmetric warfare in space, where China could exploit how much the U.S. relies on GPS and satellites. They're saying space is becoming a new battleground.
It's not just about exploring anymore. Then the book shifts to environmental and human rights issues, starting with Chapter 12, Death to a Big Planet. They go through all of China's environmental problems. Air and water pollution, water shortages, desertification. They even talk about the city, Linfen, as an example of just how bad the air pollution can get.
Yeah, and they say it's kind of self-destructive, all this pollution, because it's driven by their manufacturing for export.
Right, they're hurting themselves in the process.
Exactly. And they point out that pollution doesn't stop at borders, right? Contaminated food, competition for resources, it affects everyone. They tell this sad story about an environmental activist, Wu Liheng, who was tortured for trying to protect a lake. And they talk about soil contamination with heavy metals and chemicals and how China is a major contributor to climate change because of their reliance on coal. But the irony is, China will also be one of the worst affected by climate change because of melting glaciers.
So they're contributing to the problem that will ultimately hurt them the most.
Yeah, it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And they don't let Western companies off the hook either. They say they're complicit because they take advantage of China's lax environmental rules.
Chapter 13, Death by Repression, 1 billion Han Chinese need not apply, is about the Chinese Communist Party's totalitarian rule. They call it a class-based theocracy, with Orwell on steroids, levels of surveillance and control.
They point out there's no democracy, the party controls all information, they censor everything, and they talk about how China has these historical cycles of openness and isolation. They contrast China's past economic power with its rejection of the Industrial Revolution. They talk about Mao Zedong, how he unified China but at a huge cost, and Deng Xiaoping, who created this state-run economy that we see today.
Chapter 14, Death by China on China, is probably the most disturbing. It's about how the Communist Party treats its own people, especially minorities like Tibetans, Mongolians, and Uyghurs. Torture, forced labor, sterilization, imprisonment, executions. They say China executes more people than the rest of the world combined.
That's a lot to take in. And they talk about the consequences of the one-child policy. Forced abortions, infanticide, especially baby girls, which has led to this huge gender balance. And then there are the forced sterilizations in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and East Turkestan, which they say are part of ethnic cleansing.
Wow. They also describe the terrible working conditions in Chinese factories, even the ones making stuff for Western companies. Long hours, dangerous machines, no safety measures, even child labor. And then there's the persecution of religious groups like Falun Gong and Christians, torture, imprisonment in labor camps.
It's a very dark picture.
It is. And then the book talks about the China Apologist Coalition. These are the people the authors say haven't done enough to stop China. They divide them into 3 groups.
Yeah, the first group is the democratize and tame the dragon liberals, who think that more trade with China will lead to democracy. But the authors say that's just not true.
They've seen no evidence of that.
Right. Then there are the free trade ahead at any cost conservatives who love free trade no matter what, and they downplay the damage China is doing. The book mentions people like Dan Griswold, Ed Fielner, Greg Mankiw, Ronald McKinnon, and publications like the Financial Times and The Economist. They're saying these folks are ignoring the reality of how China operates.
And then there's the Wall Street banker expat spin doctors who are making money in China and using their influence to protect their interests, even if it hurts America. It's all about profits.
Exactly. And the authors are really critical of Presidents Bush and Obama, too. They say Bush was too focused on free trade and the wars, and Obama didn't follow through on his promises about trade reform. They're especially critical of how Treasury Secretaries Paulson and Geithner refused to call China a currency manipulator.
They also take aim at globalization gurus like Thomas Friedman, Nicholas Kristof, and Fareed Zakaria, who say American workers can't compete with low-wage countries. The authors disagree, saying we need fair trade, not just cheap labor.
And they specifically call out Zakaria for opposing Chinese currency reform.
Okay, so now the book gets to solutions. The roadmap ahead, solutions and actions. They say we need a wholesale attitude adjustment towards China, and they give recommendations for both individuals and the government.
For individuals, they say we need to be smarter consumers. Read labels, look for made in China, and try to buy stuff made elsewhere. They also talk about closing the cyber loophole for online purchases so we know where things are really coming from. And they encourage us to demand better labeling of ingredients and components so we know the origin of everything.
And they say we should let retailers know we prefer products not made in China and support businesses that offer those alternatives.
Yeah, vote with your wallet, basically.
Yeah.
On the government side, they say we need to disarm China's weapons of destruction. If they won't change, we need to hit them with countervailing duties and anti-dumping duties to offset their unfair subsidies and pricing. We need to officially label them a currency manipulator.
And they say we should block censored Chinese media and internet companies from U.S. stock markets and stop Chinese state-owned companies from buying U.S. businesses.
They also talk about beefing up counterintelligence to split up Chinese espionage and being more careful about who gets visas to come here.
So basically they're saying we need to get tough on China.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. When it comes to the military, they say we need to recognize China's industrial advantage and not get sucked into an arms race. But we also need to be honest about our vulnerabilities and understand that stopping China's economic weapons is key to preventing their military from growing even stronger.
They also have ideas for space. They say we should use our private space industry to lower costs and innovate, and we should work on international agreements for peaceful exploration and resource use.
And the book ends with a quote from Congressman Dana Rohrabacher about how we need to be more realistic about China, less naive.
So that's Death by China. It's a pretty intense book with a lot of criticism of China's actions and their impact on the world, especially the U.S. The authors say China's economic practices, human rights abuses, military buildup, and espionage are all serious threats, and they call for a big change in how we deal with them.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a good overview of their main arguments and evidence, and maybe it sparked some of those aha moments for you.
That's what we were hoping for. And now, for you, our listener, we have a question. Of all the issues raised in this book, what do you think is the most urgent? What needs the world's attention right now? And what about you personally? What responsibility do you feel you have in facing these challenges? It's a lot to think about, and we hope you'll keep exploring these questions.
It's important stuff for sure.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.